Are your students struggling to read and write Chinese characters? It's not your fault. You're up against an impossible mission. The system is broken. This is why.
They're probably aware that Chinese characters work something like emojis, except they're all in black and white, and they don't look anything like they represent. So they're left to memorize unique pieces of artwork, some with shared visual attributes, and they need minimum 3,000 to be somewhat literate in Chinese. Ideally, when they encounter a new Chinese character, instead of viewing unique artwork, they'd read its recyclable visual building blocks. And they do to an extent. We teach them about radicals, which work 58% of the time. We also teach them about phonetic sides, which work 39% of the time, although they need a wide-ranging experience in the language to even achieve these numbers. The problem is, when you calculate the probabilities, there's only a 23% chance that a character has both a working radical and phonetic side. This means that in 77% of characters they'll encounter, either the majority or the entirety of the character is essentially artwork with no obvious function. And these visual building blocks are either relatively common characters, extremely rare characters that they'll never encounter as a unique instance, or simply visual fill that was invented during some simplification process in the history of the Chinese writing system, often without a Chinese name. In fact, about 10% of visual building blocks have no names, not even in Chinese, making reading them impossible. You know the impossibility of teaching Chinese characters as unique pieces of artwork, and the data agrees with you. For long-term memory formation of one character, it seems to take about 1 hour, meaning it'll take about 3,000 hours to become somewhat literate in Chinese, which no doubt drives this massive 94% global dropout rate from Chinese second language programs. If we're to change this, something radical has to be done here. If we could get students to dissect characters into their recyclable visual building blocks, we'd have a system. And there are only about 400 of them, but nobody's entirely sure. The problem is, there is no finite list of visual building blocks. About 10% of them have no names, not even in Chinese, and there are plenty of contradictions. There's also no value set on how valuable they are across the Chinese writing set. But if we had this system, it'd be the equivalent of a 400-character alphabet to dissect any Chinese character. The absence of this system is highlighted extremely well in a 2019 book by Orton and Scrimgeour, Teaching Chinese as a Second Language. In it, the authors carry out a number of studies. This is one such study. After 6 years of learning Chinese in an Australian primary school, the students were asked to describe a Chinese character. These were their answers. A Chinese character is really bad because it has little marks like little lines. It's a bunch of lines. A whole lot of lines going everywhere to make a word. Very difficult to write because they have lots of fiddly parts. A Chinese character uses strokes. Lots of lines that started off looking like pictures but over the years has changed. It's clear from these answers that these students have wasted 6 years, or rather the system has failed them. They do not know how to proceed with Chinese characters, which they view as erratic lines with lots of fiddly parts. There's no way they can proceed on their own. And another study from the same book. This student had studied for 6 years in an intensive immersive Chinese program where maths, science and geography were all taught in Chinese. The author showed the student these characters and asked the student did they recognize them. The student said no. This despite having repeatedly encountered them in maths, science and geography. This means slope or gradient. The author then spoke the characters out loud. 斜率, 斜路, 斜率. At which point the student said, yes, they sound familiar. That sounds about right. Then the author covered the characters and asked the student to write them. This was attempt 1. Then the author uncovered the characters, they discussed them further for some moments, then covered them again and asked the student to write them again. This was attempt 2. What we can see from this is that this student can read some recyclable visual building blocks. The ren from here, the bing from here, the si from here, the shi from here, but does not have a comprehensive system that they know they can rely on to read the recyclable visual building blocks and remember their geographic location within a 2D structure. Despite all of their intensive immersion and years spent learning, this student is still prone to simple panic when it comes to the Chinese writing system. Another study, the same book. This Australian student who speaks Chinese at home with mum has studied Chinese in a second language program for 4 years. The author announced the word Australia, Australia, and then asked the student to write the characters. This was attempt 1, and this was attempt 2. And what we can see from this is sheer panic. This kid has no system, and he represents why there's a pretty standard 94% dropout rate from Chinese second language programs around the globe outside of China. In order to completely change that reality, we have to complete this system of recyclable visual building blocks, where there is a total number and a finite list of visual building blocks with no contradictions in their names or structures. We also have to see values on these recyclable visual building blocks and see how valuable they are throughout the entire Chinese writing set. Then we need to animate these recyclable visual building blocks and then gamify the entire system, training people from day one to read Chinese characters not as artwork, but as recyclable visual building blocks. In our next video, we look at our approach to character-based learning and how we feel we're designing the future of how the world will interact with Chinese characters.
Shh, your students struggle to learn Chinese characters. It's not your fault.